Okay, so many of you have heard of the infamous Google Manifesto. This is a document that came out almost a year ago in which a Google engineer claimed that the diversity efforts at Google and other companies were not only counterproductive, they were actually discriminatory against men because science and history showed that men, in fact, were better at computing, and so efforts to involve women were misplaced. A lot of the debate about this focused on the alleged science of sex difference. Some people arguing the science was bad. Some people arguing that the author had been wrong. It's part of a larger discussion within Silicon Valley about problems of diversity, race, age, and other, ideological and political. This is part of yet a larger debate about getting women more involved in technology, which I am going to argue is fundamentally wrong about a key premise of the whole debate, which is that this is something new, that we need to get women into computing and that those efforts are compensatory. In fact, women have been in computing from the very beginning. The problem is with them leaving. So this is enrollments in computer science starting in the 60s. It increases through the 80s and then starts declining. When we look in industry, there are lots of women graduating with degrees doing very well, but for some reason they leave the industry. They don't go off and retire, they leave the computer industry. I wrote a book a couple of years ago about the emergence of the software industry, about questions of expertise and power and the formation of new disciplines. I was really interested in the labor of computing, and I discovered something really interesting, that although we talked in contemporary terms about computer boys, when you in fact look at who's doing a lot of the work, they were women. Women are all over the place. These are the very first computer programmers, but women were kind of omnipresent in this industry. And so the real question is, what happened? What changed? Not how do we get women in, but why are women being forced out? And again, all over this industry through the 50s and 60s and early 70s is the idea that women are there. And this is not a story of wartime shortages of male labor. It was actually believed that women were, in fact, better than men at this particular discipline. Today, of course, computing is kind of hyper-masculine, and Silicon Valley has some real significant diversity problems. So how do we get from our idealized image of a computer programmer looking like this to looking like this? Not just male, but a really particular kind of male. I'm going to give you the really short version. One of the things that happens is professionalization. Professionalization is not a bad thing, but as you start to require, for example, academic degrees, that differentially affects certain kinds of populations. The very first computer science programs in the United States were often at universities that did not admit women. So surprise, surprise, very few women had the computer science degree that was required, for example, for ACM membership in some of the professional societies. Marie Hicks has written about the way categories of civil service jobs in Britain. Britain comes out of the war actually a leader in global information technology. They lose that lead in part, she argues, because women got structurally disqualified from computing jobs. It was a bureaucratic change. Hiring practices changed, began to focus on certain kinds of personality profiles and aptitude tests, things like the IBM Programmer Aptitude Test, which focused on often on geometrical problems, but became a kind of gatekeeper in the industry. Geometry happens to be one of the few things where there do seem to be observed sex differences between the male and female brain. It also has absolutely nothing to do with software development. These kinds of aptitude tests are still widely used in the industry, even though companies like Google are trying to move away from them. Kind of puzzles, aptitude tests, personality profiles are still used. Computing in the early 70s acquires a new reputation. We start celebrating a certain kind of person, the computer bum or hacker. We start writing books about them, whereas a decade previously, you walked into a corporate computer center, it would be full of women. You walk into MIT and Stanford's graduate training facilities, and it's full of men. In the early 1980s, these practices that take shape in these homosocial environments moves into the bedroom with the personal computer. All of this leads to a set of stories about who belongs and who doesn't, that emerge over the 1980s. We love these stories. The bright, disaffected young white man who quits college and strikes it rich. And the golden boy in computing is a consistent theme. Even women who succeed in this industry generally have to conform to these stereotypes. So what do we do about this? Better science. This whole discussion about whether women are smart enough is premised on culturally specific notions of what it means to be smart. We need to study the science of implicit bias rather than the science of aptitude. We need a better culture in our universities and in our firms. We need better spaces. This is appealing to a certain kind of person and not so appealing to another kind of person who maybe doesn't want to think of their workspace as also a living space. We need better history. We need to actually reveal these stories, because when we get better history, we get better stories more generally. And that has been changing. It's not saying women get into something that for which you have never belonged. It's saying get back to something you were really good at and you were present from the beginning. I'm really excited that some of my own historical research, which seems a little arcane, has been changing these debates at the public level. I'm out of time. Thank you very much.